continental risk profile, the impact of geopolitical tensions in countries like South Sudan, Mozambique, Eastern DRC, Central Republic, African Republic, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Now, how can I put geopolitical tensions in countries like South Sudan and Mozambique, right, impacted the regional stability and security dynamics? And how does this affect intra-Africa trade, right? Especially considering the implementation of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And again, I'd like you to connect this to other geopolitical issues in Europe, particularly in terms of commodities. Why is it that in Africa, in particular, it's mainly your resource-rich countries that are involved in these geopolitical tensions? You will never find a landlocked, resource-scarce country like Malawi being attacked, you know?
No, absolutely. There seems to be a common denominator that when you are resource-rich, there's got to be some element of instability. I wouldn't want to accuse anybody from the West, but there's great interest. I mean, if you look at the potential for Sudan, oil and gas, gold, the conflict that still is ravaging that country is the most unfortunate. And Sudan is an interesting case because for a very long time it was engaged in a civil war between the North and the South. And Africans came together through the African Union to try and find a solution for that country. And that's how a new state was born in the 21st century, which was South Sudan. Just after they achieved that, when we thought that there would now be peace in that part of the world, of course you had al-Bashir, who was now charged by the International Court. I know we're supposed to have arrested him here. After they removed him, you have the kind of chaos that you now have in Khartoum. So there are external factors that seem to be following us everywhere where there's prospect for prosperity. Same applies in Mozambique. The discovery of gas, oil and gas, has attracted foreign players. And all of a sudden we have very complex conflicts that are very difficult for many of us to understand, but there is that common denominator.
So now what are the implications of these geopolitical tensions for neighboring countries and the wider African continent? I mean, you've got on the one hand, Africa Free Trade Agreement that's promoting intra-Africa trade. But how do you implement that when there's no peace and stability in some of these countries? Just use the Mozambican example. We need gas. If you look at our integrated resource plan, gas solution comes from Mozambique.
Absolutely.
If you look at the RP, hydro, we're talking DRC.
Absolutely.
Right? These are our neighbors. So now the question is, how do we mitigate these geopolitical tensions?
You know, to realize the full potential, economic potential of the continent, Africa has got to be at peace with itself. It's number one. Otherwise, we will not be able to realize the full extent of the economic development that we can achieve with the African continental free trade, for instance. So we need peace in every square meter of this territory for us to be able to realize that. That's number one. And of course, I think the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is quite a significant step forward because it represents an African consensus on economic development that we've not seen before, where the majority of the countries have deposited instruments of ratification for the for the agreement. Some have signed the agreement, but there seems to be an overwhelming pan-African consensus about creating the largest customs union, which will have over 1 billion people, over 1 billion customers, that would allow the free trade amongst ourselves, but also would enable us to be a bloc that is able to negotiate a better deal within the context, for instance, of WTO.
Right.
So it's a very, very important point. And I think as South Africa, if I may just say, we need to start looking, our policymakers must start looking at that as an opportunity.
Right.
Adapt our industrial policy to speak to this particular opportunity.
Right.
We're talking about the automotive industry earlier on. With that, in effect, it means that the South African automotive industry now has a market much bigger than what the United States is.
Right.
So it's an exceptionally important point for us to understand. Yeah.
Great. Now, how do we benefit from this? We're part of the expanded BRICS group, which is likely made up of resource-rich countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. How do we ensure that this benefits Africa as well? I'm asking this in the context of the Africa Free Trade Agreement.
Well, I think what the free trade agreement does is that it creates a $3 trillion GDP, which is an African GDP as we speak. And secondly, of course, as I was saying, it creates a customs union of over 1 billion people. So Africa is becoming an equal partner in this partnership. And it means that, of course, because in a partnership like this, there's nothing that stops us from making propositions within the context of the partnerships that are going to contribute to our own economic development.
Right.
But secondly, most importantly, within the context of BRICS, we have, I think, about 2 of the permanent UN Security members, UN Security Council members.
Yeah.
Part of our foreign policy has been to push for the democratization of the United Nations. And there are many other issues at a multilateral level that we can use this BRICS formation to be able to advance at different levels. I'm just making an example of our foreign policy stance on the United Nations. We've got China as part of the BRICS. We've got Russia as part of the BRICS. These are permanent members of UN Security Council that can be able to advance some of our foreign policy objectives. So it is very useful in many ways. Now, obviously, as I was saying earlier, this is the largest chunk of the global GDP.
Right.
So the benefits, there's plethora of benefits, and implementations are enormous.
Right. Now, let's bring in closer to that. I mean, earlier on we were talking about all these threats that are rising tensions in the relationship between the United States and South Africa. If we were to be given an opportunity to change the economic architecture of South Africa and use the BRICS vehicle to map an alternative economic growth path, how would you map that? Because it's a shift from your top 4 trading partners in Europe, USA, to now aligning yourself with China, Russia, Iran, UAE, Egypt. How would that work? How would that be new economic architecture?
I think, Dennis, that's already happening. I think the US is a superpower in decline. I think now we are talking about multipolarity, multipolar game theory. South Africa, like many other emerging markets, are realigning themselves, particularly because the US government has used its monopoly over the financial system to its advantage. So it's not even a question of being offensive to the United States, but it's a question of risk mitigation and creating other alternatives. So the world is moving away from the West. And there's now a BRICS Bank, for instance, which is going to replace the IMF and the World Bank. These are institutions, platinum institutions that were set up after the Second World War, which have been mainly responsible for economic colonialism, which has continued, particularly from an African perspective. So you are seeing this shift, this dramatic seismic shift from West to the East, and South Africa is very much part of that. And it's very difficult to have a very clear road path when we're talking about a shift of this magnitude. But there are certain elements which are fundamental, which I think have already started, which, as I'm saying, a bank like that, which is a multilateral bank, which will fund infrastructure and development on much more preferential terms than what we're getting from Washington.
Right. So, as we wrap up, I'd like us now to sum it up. We've discussed a number of threats that we face with as South Africa. I mentioned our relationship with the US. We've also mentioned the perceived threat that seems from the US side in terms of our proximity to the expanded BRICS group. But then the third one is all these geopolitical tensions taking place in Africa. So now we are talking about how do we reposition ourselves as South Africa? How do we redefine our foreign policy such that there's not ambiguity? It's clear what we stand for. Because right now we are seen as a country that is not really pushing and pursuing human rights issues like Nelson Mandela used to do. We are seen as a country that is opportunistic. When it's Ukraine, Russia, we support Russia. But when it comes to Palestine and Israel, we support Palestine. And we ignore what's happening in South Sudan because there are millions of people there. How do we reposition ourselves as South Africa so that we become a trusted leader in the continent and in the world?
You know, what people don't talk about often is the extent to which the South African government has invested in conflict resolution on the continent. People do not know that South African armed forces were in South Sudan to prevent a genocide in Darfur. People do not know that the South African armed forces are in Central African Republic. People do not know that South African armed forces are in the DRC. These are physical boots on the ground that South African taxpayers are paying for, to underscore the extent to which we are committed to conflict resolution on the continent. So it is not true that we are only excited or excitable by getting involved in affairs that are outside this continent. We've invested greatly. The Inter-Congolese dialogue, the founding of a state that is now called Congo, was done here in the Sun City. South Africans, taxpayers, ensured that that country exists today. So we have been able to invest a great deal into the expression of our own foreign policy on the continent.
On that note, thank you, Mr. Ngele. A big round of applause for our guests. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this insightful journey with Mr. Ngele. We've explored, the complexities of global trade, geopolitics, economic development, and I think you've noticed that throughout our discussion, we explored pressing questions surrounding trade tariffs, sanctions, and the impact on the international context. These are difficult conversations to have. These are difficult questions. But we also examined the potential ramifications of South Africa's possible expulsion from AGOA trade agreement. We've also looked at, we explored how South Africa's alliance with BRICS and its partnership and the Africa Free Trade Agreement could shape an alternative global economic path for South Africa. We'll explore that. But as we conclude, we left with a number of interesting questions about strategies South Africa can employ to leverage its alliances and agreements for economic diversification and resilience, as we mentioned. But then if we look at our economic indicators, we need to start interrogating that, especially if you look at the investment index. Are we still an investor-friendly country? If you take into account particularly what the former minister, Travamanyo, mentioned a few weeks ago, that in the last decade, we've lost trillions in terms of capital in this country because of policy uncertainty and capital going to move into more regulated regions. As we wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank our guest, Mr. Wandile Nene, and everyone else. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's a wrap.